we, for years, in terms of thinking about why we go to all the effort of creating these mixed-use environments is to have something that is truly differentiated from a commodity. And most of the tenants we lease to are in our projects because they understand their space as a tool in recruiting and retaining the best talent, right? And so I still think that is going to apply, but it may be that offices are, become more of what I would call a culture hub or a collaboration hub than thinking about it as if people are coming there every day.
Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Powers, and I want to thank you for joining me on the Fort Podcast today. This show is an open-ended discussion and journey covering real estate, business, entrepreneurship, and investing. I would love to hear from you by tweeting me at Fort Worth Chris on Twitter. Hey guys, it's Chris. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Fort. I am really excited to have Jonathan Brinsden with me today. Jonathan is the CEO of Midway Companies down in Houston, Texas, one of the largest mixed-use developers in Houston and across the state. They have built some of the most iconic properties in Houston, have a portfolio of $2 billion, are one of the most thoughtful community builders that I've ever come across. Their attention to detail and the amount of effort they put into building places that people love speaks for itself. If you ever have a chance to, and you're in Houston, I highly encourage you to go check out one of their properties. We talk a lot today about Jonathan's story and how he came to Midway. We dive deep into the Midway company and how they think about real estate, how they think about designing projects, the process that they go through, the level of detail and attention. We touch base on Houston, what's going on in the Houston market, kind of in a post-COVID world. We go through the asset types that Midway focuses on: office, retail, hotel, and residential, and kind of the current state of affairs there and some of the insights that they have into how these asset classes will progress in the future. We talk about just kind of development and some of the nuances that make development tough. And we talk about his leadership of ULI, where he's currently the chairman of Americas. This really is a fascinating episode, and thank you again for joining me today. Jonathan, thank you for joining me on the show today.
Yeah, great to be with you.
I appreciate you taking the time. Can we just start with just a little bit of background on kind of your story and leading you to where you are today at Midway?
Sure. I always tell people growing up, for whatever reason, there were two things I was fascinated with, and that was buildings and cars. And originally went to A&M to get a mechanical engineering degree to hopefully then go to automotive design school. I was not a stellar student my first year at A&M. Engineering was a challenge. I like to tell people I got a 3.6. Unfortunately, that was the sum of my first two semesters. So 1.8 or 1.8. So I switched over to architecture, which was actually great. It was sort of a creative avenue. And actually, when I look back on it, beyond being sort of about architecture, it was actually a great problem-solving degree. And I did that along with construction science, and was fortunate to intern with a construction company that was owned by a development company. And that's really where I got a window into, what that really was and the role was, and quickly decided that's what I wanted to do. So stayed and got my master's to really get the business side. And when I got out of graduate school, it was in 1994, where really Texas was still recovering from the late 80s and not a lot of development going on. And I interviewed with all the usual suspects, and folks just, said, that's nice, but, we don't have any development jobs. And so fortunately, a guy at my church had heard that I was interested. He said, look, I've had to lay a lot of people off through the downturn, but I've got this one project, and it'll be easier for you to get a job if you have a job. So just, come work with me and see how it goes. And it was a great experience because I got to do everything sort of soup to nuts. And I actually ended up staying about 7 years, became president of the company, and we built shopping centers and some medical office buildings and some hotels. And we did a lot, and I learned a lot. we got to a point where he and I sort of disagreed on some fundamental decisions. And at the time, that was really, to me, it was about values. It was, there was not, none of these things were gray areas for me. And so I opted to leave and actually picked 5 people I was going to reach out to in the industry. And the first one I called said, I know exactly where you need to go. And I thought he was joking. And he said, I'm going to call this guy and call you back. So he called back, said, okay, call this guy Brad Friels. And Brad's our chairman. And Brad and I met the next couple of days, hit it off, sort of negotiated. And that was October of 2000. We kind of agreed on a deal, but I still had 2 hotels under construction. And I had promised the bank I would not leave. I told them I was leaving, but I would not leave before they were open. And so those hotels opened on a Friday in April of 2001. They opened and I started at Midway on the following Monday. And really the fit was Midway had grown up, been around for a long time, founded in Dallas. And our name comes from Midway Road. And Metropolitan Business Park was a big project of theirs. But Brad had just gotten sort of frustrated essentially on how commoditized, the industrial build-to-suit business had gotten and some other things. And I think just from an interest level, he was ready to try some other things. So my job was really to come in and diversify the company into doing other things. And so we did a number of office projects and some hotels and corporate headquarters, but city center, and I'm sure we'll talk about it at some point, really the opportunity to buy the old Town and Country Mall in 2004 was sort of, for me, that was the real pivot point in terms of what I was doing and how we were gonna grow the company. So
I love it. Well, we were going to talk about that a little later, but why don't we just go into it right now? That's one of the most notable projects y'all have done. Can you just kind of describe kind of how that deal came about and kind of what the last 15 years of working on that project has been like?
Yeah, I mean, we've been blessed and it's been really rewarding. Not to say it's hasn't been without its challenges, but I think one of the things I love to look at, was our original offering memorandum on it. And I read it today and think I wouldn't have given us, $10 to go. But in a funny way, we bought the mall in May of 2004. We did a ton of research. We went to, 27 projects in 17 cities. And we had done each of the pieces, among each of us collectively. So it wasn't that we didn't know the products. It was really learning how do you put it all together. And I think there was a real sense of stewardship that it was a special piece of property. And we had opportunities to flip it, and big box retail could have gone on it. We had a very successful open air shopping center next to us with Town and Country Village, and we just had conviction that we were going to do it. And if we did it and did it right, that would be a real springboard for us as a company, which played out. We started in 2007, and I think the opportunity to get it capitalized, honestly, was just 2007 was a very frothy capital market. Then took us 2 years to build it, and then we delivered into what was potentially one of the scariest and worst economic environments with the financial crisis. And we had one of the blessings in some ways, we had capitalized each use independently. So it actually insulated us from some of we had a bank fail, we had an institutional partner fail, we had a super high net worth individual as a partner fail. And so fortunately, those were somewhat dispersed in different areas. And so it really, helped us keep the whole thing together. And I give our equity partners, especially on the retail, a ton of credit that they stuck with us in terms of the long-term vision. They could have said, look, just go fill it up. Well, that is completely counter to, the environment you're trying to create and all the synergies you're trying to create. And, it's about, the value being greater than the sum of the parts. But if you get one part wrong, then it detracts from the rest of it. And so we were blessed, and, it's hard to believe now it's over 10 years old. And so today we're having fun with it in terms of starting to think about how do we reimagine this place and where are there opportunities for densification. And we've bought a few adjacent tracks, and like Marathon, we just recently sold a track to Marathon Oil, and there's going to be 2,000 people there, and that in itself will add a whole nother dynamic to the project. So it's just been fun to watch it evolve and continue to evolve. And as I said, we've been blessed, and in some ways I get tired talking about it because we have so much other things going on. I love to talk about those, but at the same time, it has been a remarkable project, and extremely proud of it. And like I said, it still evolves, and as I'm sure it will for the next 10 years. So.
Yeah. Just to paint that picture of '04, this mall comes up for sale. Was it a vacant mall? Did it have tenants? Like, what was the draw to it? How big was it? Like, why was this the magic property to buy?
Yeah, so we were able to buy it an off-market transaction, and essentially an individual had bought it from an insurance company that had foreclosed on it. And for reference, we had Memorial City Mall literally a mile just east down the road. The reality is the market didn't need two malls within a mile of each other. So a number of the department stores had left to go to Memorial City. We had a Neiman Marcus that was still open, but it was about a million square foot, 3-story mall that had 45 tenants that were largely mom and pops. And the gentleman who had bought it didn't really appreciate, I think, what he was buying and the intricacies of the legal structures in a mall. So essentially, if one of those mom and pop tenants were open or one of the anchor tenants was open, he was obligated to operate the entire mall. And so there you were, right? Electricity, parking garages. I mean, you're spending a lot of money to keep something operating that fundamentally it's a cost structure you can support. And so, he loved it. He didn't really want to sell it, but I think we went to him with an offer that still made sense for us from a basis standpoint, but kind of gave him the opportunity to make a good entrepreneurial return. The funny part was when he agreed to do it, he said, okay, we're going to do it, but we're going to do it fast. You guys have 30 days due diligence and 30 days to close, which was a lot to work through and for buying a mall. So.
Yep. And then when you bought it, did you have to ask the other tenants to leave or let their leases run dry, or like how did y'all?
Yeah, well, talk about being sometimes luckier than you are good. So the linchpin in the whole thing was Neiman Marcus. So even if we bought it from this gentleman, we were going to have the same issue he did if Neiman Marcus wanted to stay open and operating, meaning we would have to operate the mall and we couldn't tear it down, which ultimately we wanted to get to the land. So we called Neiman Marcus, and at the time, the director of real estate, he was just a great guy. And we said, look, this is our vision. Would you, release us from the encumbrances? We would, we could let your store be freestanding in this new, open air mixed use environment. And he was actually, very gracious and on board with that, involved him in the master planning process. And some of the early plans had the Neiman Marcus in it. And then he called back one day and said, would y'all be interested in a sale leaseback? And we said, well, sure, that's, we would love to control that real estate. And he wanted a really short time frame to get out of the lease. And he said, look, I'm under confidentiality and I can't tell you exactly what's going on. All I can tell you is if you want to get back to the dirt on all of this, you should do this. And ultimately, what we learned is the company was for sale. That's when Neiman Marcus was sold to a private equity firm. They had never closed a store in their history, but they had slated with the acquisition to close 2 stores, one of which was this location. And so that was really that was the key. And it was just pure luck from a timing standpoint.
And then you said you went and you visited 27 different locations around the country. And maybe my question is, a lot of development for folks that don't develop, they don't understand how much planning and things happen in the years prior to seeing things go vertical. On a deal that big, and I'm sure it has evolved, like, how do you come to, okay, this is the final plan? Because when you're just messing around with architects and paper and you're moving buildings around, everything can seem great. Like, at what point do you just say, like, okay, this is it?
Right. I think one of the most instructive things from, I would say, And we still do it to this day. But when we go off and do research for a project, one of the things we try to do is distill down what do we have conviction about as the guiding principles for a project? And those guiding principles are kind of like a North Star, because a lot of things are going to come at you, right? And you're going to have to make decisions. To your point, at some point you're going to have to stick with it and move on. And so those guiding principles are critically important. One of the guiding principles was really this idea of sort of authenticity relative to urbanism. A number of projects we visited felt a bit more like Disneyland, if you will. It sort of was a thin veiled effort at urbanism and even the way the architecture and things were doing. So one of the things we worked with the land planner was to be authentic about urbanism. Essentially, you need an urban grid. And we set up kind of a street system and a master plan that then allowed us a lot of flexibility within what would fit in that street grid. And as an example, I mean, like Lifetime Fitness, which was an early, really important deal, they moved 3 times on the site before, we finalized the deal. But essentially, the integrity of the master plan never changed. We were just kind of plugging them into different locations. And so, but to your point, I mean, we bought the mall in May of 2004. It took us the research in the second half of 2004 and master planning, and really all the way through 2006 to really have our arms around, specifically what we were going to do. And it's like anything, Brad Friels, our chairman, has a saying, and, I agree. He said, every time we start a project, it's like throwing a party. We just don't know who's going to show up. And it's true, and it's true. You have to be, reactive and proactive about opportunities when they present themselves. And a lot of the times you just don't anticipate what's going to come at you. And so I think that's one of the challenges. And then to my earlier comment, just knowing that every decision you make, especially about a use or even a tenant, impacts everything else, right? So, like an example of Lifetime set a quality standard. There were probably other fitness options, but they wouldn't have had the same impact on the project as a whole as really working with Lifetime and choosing them.
On the website, I read 2 million square feet, but like, where do we stand today with that project?
Yeah, so it's just a little over 2 million, which is the original 37 acres. We bought an additional 6 acres, half of which Marathon is on now. So they've added another 500,000 feet. We have a 6th office building that's planned adjacent to them. That's another 300,000 feet. And then we also bought another 3.5 acres adjacent to us that has a second hotel and another office building. And so when it's all said and done, it should grow to just north of 3 million feet when it's done.
And I'm going to go ahead and say it for you. I had the pleasure of walking several of your projects. Y'all are incredible at what you do. And I've asked you this when we've been walking around. And as a developer myself, when I walk around y'all's projects, there's so many little details that are happening to create the experience that people are experiencing when they're walking through a project. I can't remember exactly how I asked it for you, but I said, how do you program all this stuff? And how do you know which events are going to be in the central green space and which flowers are going to be in the pots and the music that's playing? So maybe can you walk me through like the programming and y'all have tons of mixed use developments going on, but how do you think about programming? Is it almost a business in itself? And do tenants pay like an HOA or is it included in the triple nets for all that outdoor experience?
Yeah. So I'll start high level. I mean, I think in any of our projects, ultimately what we're trying to build or connect with is community, right? And so we see programming as that, probably one of the most important connection points. And I'll be honest, when we originally opened City Center, and between the property management and the programming, we completely underestimated what it would take. And so what I tell folks is, running these projects is truly like running a small city. It's 24/7. It never turns off, and it takes a ton of time and effort and focus to do it well and do it right. The event programming, So last year we programmed 578 events across our portfolio, and so you realize you are in that business, and we have a robust marketing team that does that. What's rewarding about it is in the life of a project, early on, you're planning all those events. And then as it becomes a community place, the community then and tons of people come to you and say, can I do this or can I do that? Or, hey, can we hold this here? And so it's really rewarding that suddenly your calendar that you were planning 100% of swings actually, something like 60 to 70% is literally being driven by the community. And so it's the local Mustang club coming here. But the one that shocks me is, a Lamborghini club said, we want to have an event. And we've done it now for 4 years. And we now have people that come from all over the world, that for that event. That's how it's grown. They have cars shipped here. And so that's the fun part. I mean, that's where you realize, okay, we've done something right in the sense that everyone else feels that like this is theirs and they have some level of ownership and this is where they come to interact with their community. So,
and on the last comment you made about feeling authentic and it not feeling kind of like this Disneyland, are there certain things that kind of after all this experience that are kind of amenities that'll stand the test of times, and maybe some things that, when you see them, you're like, this is a fad and it won't be an amenity for long? Like, maybe my question is, what are the things that make an amenity have longevity?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it is difficult at times, to resist decisions that may be short term or maybe a fad, but we've always had conviction, I think, about health and wellness and felt like that is something that will have legs for a long time. And so whether it's the specific fitness tenant we have or the fact that, we have outdoor space and we even do fitness programming in the plaza and then really among a choice of food and beverage options that, that offer healthy choices. And so I think that's one. And there is a real kind of degree of authenticity and human connection in that. And so, we try to find things that we think are longer term trends and not just sort of, kind of short term gimmicky connection points. And in some ways, the programming we do now, it is and even where we add amenities is a process of really saying no to a lot of things to make sure we say yes to the right things.
All right, I'm going to shift a little bit. Want to talk about Houston just in general. Y'all are one of the largest developers and owners of property in Houston. So just want to get a kind of an update on where Houston stands today. And then I want to dive further into different asset types that y'all work on. So first question, how is Houston kind of holding up in a post-COVID world?
Yeah, I think for Houston, it's a little tough right now in the sense that we have the double whammy. We have an oil and gas market overhang along with COVID, and I think that's kind of exacerbated some market issues. But the city feels open, and I think everyone's trying to find that balance. And I know we are as a landlord as to how do we have some sense of normalcy and yet be honest and respectful and understanding of the situation we're in and make sure we're not putting people at risk. And I think, working with a lot of our tenants and even like our programming and those kind of things is really trying to balance all of that. Because if you distill what we're about, which I mentioned is kind of building community, which is fundamentally bringing people together, right? COVID has now put the world on the opposite end of that spectrum. And so I think we're trying to balance on, within reason, where should we be right now and where can we go with this? And it's been a challenge.
Is Houston as dependent on the oil and gas industry today as it was maybe 20 years ago, or has it been weaning off oil and gas for the last couple decades?
Yeah, I think it's a lot more resilient than it was, but you also can't ignore the fact that it's still a big segment of our economy and a big employer. So for a big part of recent history it's been a big driver of jobs, and actually, high paying jobs. In some ways, the oil and gas industry today looks more like the tech industry in terms of the type of people they hire. So when that flattens out or we have layoffs, I mean, we feel it. It's not like it's not a blue collar, right, phenomenon. It is truly some of the highest paying jobs we have in the city.
Last question on Houston. Houston's notorious for not having zoning over most of the city. So my first question, is that ultimately a good thing for developers, or is it not a good thing? Or is that the wrong question to ask?
Yeah. So, and I think you have to be careful of separating the notion of zoning and the notion of planning. And we've gotten better in Houston about, I mean, I don't think we're ever going to get to a point in Houston where we have zoning. I'm completely fine with that. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't have planning. And actually, planning is done both at the sort of citywide level, but then, one of the most powerful things we have is we have some great management districts that really also serve that long-term planning. And so whether it's, Uptown District or Central Houston, those, they actually play a really important role. And I think what we've got to be better at Houston is making sure those are not plans done in isolation, that we're connecting the dots and understanding where the urban fabric overlaps. And I think we're getting a lot better at that in Houston. The other thing is I actually believe no zoning is a positive. And there's not been specific research on it, but I think, we're the most diverse city in the country with probably the least amount of racial tension. And I actually believe not having zoning plays a role in that. I think we end up having a much more integrated community without zoning.
Interesting. I've never thought about it that way. So Midway focuses on office, retail, hotel, and residential in their mixed-use deals. I'm going to start with the two maybe most talked about right now, retail and hotels.
Yeah, I was going to say 2 of those keep me up at night.
Yeah. I saw you. I heard you take a deep breath. I'm just going to ask the most obvious question is and I'll ask it for each asset class, but what are you seeing in retail kind of now and maybe just a little bit of color of how that's progressed since March?
Sure. So I think from a macro standpoint, and this is across many businesses, just not real estate, but in a way, COVID has accelerated trends that already existed. And so I think that's a lot of what we're dealing with. In retail, there's no way around when essentially a city is shut down that those businesses are impacted. Our view has been we're going to do everything in our power to work with our tenants to help them survive and be successful. And I think fortunately so far in the industry, especially on the lending side, everyone's been very practical in understanding that if you believe the universe of tenants is shrinking and you have good tenants, then you figure out how to keep those tenants. The other thing I would say is it's been pretty amazing and exciting to watch how some tenants have adapted and figured out, right, how to keep business, how to do, farmers markets, and how to, it's just been, that part has been fun in the context of, of a lot of difficult things. And so the other thing I would say is if a business was weak pre-COVID, then it's just exposed the weaknesses. Good businesses will come out the other side of COVID. And so we're just focused on trying to be a good partner with our retail and restaurant tenants. And for the most part, knock on wood, I think we're all in pretty good shape. I do worry a little bit about just sort of how long this overhang, is and when we quote might get back to normal, whatever that is. And so the hospitality side is probably the most challenging. And again, Houston's a little bit exasperated because we are not a big leisure travel city. We are largely a business travel city, although we do actually have great weekend business in our hotels because they're in the context of our mixed use projects. We tend to get the weddings and the staycations, so we do better than most. But then additionally, you have the overhang of the oil and gas business, which is also a big hotel driver, especially international business. I mean, in our two hotels in Houston, we, on any given year, we have people from more than 50 countries. I couldn't name 50 countries, but I mean, that gives you a sense of the diversity of the travel. And so we are actually, we're not doing great, but we're actually building market share and doing much better than our competitive set. But it's, I think the reality is until we have a vaccine or something that makes big companies feel comfortable going back to work and comfortable traveling, it's going to be, it's going to be tough.
And I'm with you 100% on COVID's just exposed trends, exposed weaknesses. It's further advanced kind of the use of technology. As it relates to retail, is leasing activity, are tenants out in the market, or is everything kind of just dead right now?
Yeah, no, it's so like at City Center, we're working on 5 new retail lease deals.
Wow.
Several of which are fairly big names you would recognize, one of which wants to be open by Christmas. And so it's few and far between, but there is activity. And again, to the extent tenants were successful and they're really good businesses, some are going to have opportunities to get into space that, wasn't available before. So I think you're going to see some tenants be proactive. And, on projects we're pre-leasing, we had a number of large projects we were going to start early this year and then postponed. But just in the last month, really, we've seen interest kind of on a pre-leasing level of certain folks wanting to, ready to have conversations about doing something new. And so that's been refreshing.
I love it. My last question as it relates to retail. Is there anything that you're starting to see in lease proposals that you've never seen before, force majeure? Just what are they asking?
Yeah. Well, I think, the sort of call it what you want, but I'll call it the pandemic clause, which was not in a lot of leases, which is essentially going to, allow a tenant to shut down and not pay rent, is going to work its way into the leases. And I think that's probably going to be the case for office as well. But it's certainly been more prevalent in recent conversations in retail. And I think it's really an insurance question, right? It's sort of a business interruption question. And so either we're going to have to insure, if they're going to be adamant about it, then we're going to have to insure against it on the landlord side. And I think the real question for the tenants is, are they better off paying us to get the insurance, or are they better off insuring themselves against those situations? And so it's going to be a really, there's going to be a cost. And so I think the question is, who's going to bear that cost? And maybe more importantly, what's the most cost effective way to insure it?
Office, smaller businesses tend to be going back quicker. Large corporations are, you're hearing not moving in till 2021, middle of 2021, 2022. But most of them are still paying rent. I guess the question is, are your tenants, are Houston office tenants showing up? And then do you have an opinion on, is there permanent damage to office with work from home and remote becoming kind of more apparent to everybody?
Yeah. So first I'll take sort of, or I'll agree with what you said. I think we're tending to see the trend was, smaller private companies coming back to work. We were back in the office October 1st. And, if I use my own team as somewhat of a gauge, is we had a lot of people ready to come back. There was sort of a honeymoon period of working from home that was maybe 60, maybe 90 days. And then it got to be Groundhog's Day. And they're like, okay, this is not, this is not fun anymore. I'm ready to go back to the office. I think one of the things that I know we deal with it with our team, and is still a challenge for folks, is how people are handling the school situation. And so I think we forget that kids going to school is such an integral part of how people's lives work. And so you have that challenge. In terms of well, and then I'll say the big companies, especially the international companies, are the ones that are moving slowest. And I think that's just because they have a broader perspective beyond the U.S. and, say what's going on in Europe. And so they seem to be the ones that are moving slowest. In terms of long-term impact, I don't think we can be naive and say, this experiment, if you will, and working from home isn't going to impact how people use office space. And we, for years, in terms of thinking about why we go to all the effort of creating these mixed use environments is to have something that is truly differentiated from a commodity. And most of the tenants we lease to are in our projects because they understand their space as a tool in recruiting and retaining the best talent, right? And so I still think that is going to apply, but it may be that offices are, become more of what I would call a culture hub or a collaboration hub than thinking about it as if people are coming there every day. And so, work from home might be 1 or 2 days a week. But I think the net, a lot of the tenants I talk to, if they really think through what that culture hub looks like, it's probably on a net basis, not a different amount of space. Now, a number of companies we've talked to have said, well, maybe instead of having one centralized space, we need a couple or, say 2 to 3 still great spaces, still foster that culture and collaboration, but a little bit more distributed. So I was talking to actually a large REIT office tenant today, and that was sort of his gut. He said, we have 90,000 feet in one location, and I'm thinking maybe what we need is like 50 and 20 and 20, right? So it's, my team members have clearly said the benefit from working at home was not necessarily working at home, but reducing commute time and having more time with their family. And so, it's going to have an impact. What the true kind of net ramifications are on square footage, I don't know. I think the big impact is, in terms of the office environments or the environments buildings are in, it's going to exacerbate, I think, the haves and the have-nots. And, we may very, very well see, some significant obsolescence in certain types of office buildings.
I agree with you on everything you said. I mean, as a business owner myself, and I love how you call it a culture hub or a collaboration hub. It's really hard to build culture through Zoom, and it starts feeling pretty fake after a while.
Right.
And then I think about the kid or the young man that just got out of college, or the young woman that just got out of college and is showing up to their first day at work and needs years of mentoring and folks that have experience around them. And I just can't imagine showing up to my first day at work, sitting in my bedroom, buying into the culture, buying into mentorship. It's just very hard to do through, Zoom. And I think the office, in my opinion, is actually going to be more appreciated than it ever has been, maybe in a different way. But I'm with you. Most people I'm talking to want to be back.
Yeah. And I think that I 100% agree with your point. And maybe the piece we forget that is so powerful is what I would call the informal mentorship, where you are learning because you're in the room and you're observing and you're listening. And it may not even be in a formal meeting. It's just being in the office and listening to other people on simple things like, how does someone handle a phone call, or, and that type of informal mentorship is, it's incredibly important for folks. And so,
is there anything, we kind of talked about how y'all are operating your properties. Is there anything that kind of comes off the top of your head of new technology or things you've implemented in your buildings that, might be kind of permanent changes to make things kind of safer for the next couple of years?
Not specifically yet, but we're looking at a number of things. I think air quality will be at the top of the list of buildings, both, are there upgrades we should be making in our existing portfolio, or are there essentially changes to specs and technology we need to be making in our new buildings? I think that one's at the top. I think we're fortunate in the sense that our portfolio is positioned very well relative to what I think is important to tenants in a post-COVID environment. But that being said, we're really thinking through things that are maybe seemingly simple, but how do we make much bigger and inviting and usable stairwells in office buildings versus, kind of the more typical fire stair. And so, we're really trying to think through how might people want to use the buildings differently. And we sort of talk about post-COVID, but I don't think you can look at it like this is sort of a one-time phenomenon, right? So I think there are a lot of, while not technology, there's a lot of operational things we've learned in terms of, how we communicate with tenants and, how people conduct themselves. And so, there are a lot of lessons both learned and to be learned for sure.
Are y'all going to be aggressively looking to acquire more retail or hotels if there's a buying opportunity, or how you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in Houston, multifamily's been fairly soft. I think the market environment presents an interesting opportunity in the sense that we're seeing a lot of institutional capital start to push properties to market, and not because it's a good time to sell. They're just raising capital, I think, to have money to be opportunistic. And the fact that right now institutional capital is really not playing in the market. And so they're a bit frozen. And so we see a window where we can be nimble. And so right now we're looking at two opportunities in Houston where we're buying, great Class A, multifamily at or below replacement cost. And we like that thesis. Actually, one of them is one of our own projects that we sold, and we're buying back. Hotels are obviously going to be hit hard, and we're already seeing we're seeing sort of paper come to the market. We're not. I don't think we're great at buying debt per se, but we are looking at one hotel acquisition opportunity now. I would say that's more. It's not so much that we love the hotel; we like the basis and the opportunity to have a covered land play. I mean, we're comfortable with hotels. We're happy to operate it, but it's one where the price is so discounted that it just makes the land attractive. But that's a long answer to say, yes, we think there's going to be a lot of opportunity, and we're hoping to take advantage of that. And I agree. I mean, I think I've been in the room with groups of institutional investors where some of them are prognosticating that retail is not even going to be an institutional asset class anymore. And so that just to me says opportunity. And so
Yep.
it's going to be fascinating to watch it unfold.
And I'm assuming as far as new development in the hotel or retail world, we're probably going to see that hit pause for quite some time. It's going to be more acquisition of existing assets, or do you think we'll see kind of new stuff coming out of the ground anytime soon?
Yeah, I think if you do, it will be limited, and it will be very specific opportunities. But I think the hotel development pipeline is largely shut down, which is a good thing. I mean, it's when the business is tough already, you don't need new supply coming online, and so I think it's going to be fairly limited. And to the extent we hope to push forward with development, I mean, retail is an important part of what we do from an amenity standpoint. But if I think about the things we're probably going to try to push forward on, I mean, the retail is still on a relative basis, a fairly small amount of square footage.
A few just questions on just development in general. Are a lot of your developments public, private, or are they all private?
We have a mixture of both. City Center, for example, is all private. One of the projects I'm most proud of is called Kirby Grove. That was a public-private partnership to essentially redevelop an old park, and it's generally located between River Oaks and West U. And we came up with a financial structure where we sort of fabricated a core location for ourselves because of the adjacency to the park. But our development also created the financial opportunity to actually have funds to redevelop this park and ultimately pay for its long-term maintenance. I mean, and that park won a ULI Global Open Space Award. And, when I think how that park has truly changed the dynamic for people in that area, it's fantastic. And so we have other projects that sort of had limited participation from a public standpoint. So that might have been, reimbursement of TERS dollars or TIF dollars. Our East River project, that's 150 acres. it'll be the equivalent of 65 downtown blocks. It's truly building a city. I mean, it'll be 4 city centers when it's done. I mean, that in itself is a massive infrastructure project, and we're in the midst of kind of negotiating our long-term agreement with the city on how reimbursements work. We really have a variety of structures, across our portfolio, and I think the key is 2 things. One is, and you always get this from the public sector, is the but for, meaning without their participation, would something go forward, or would it be of a quality that has kind of the community impact that they would want? And then the second is really from our standpoint is more of from a control standpoint, what are we potentially giving up relative to the benefit? And so in the case of City Center, we had an opportunity to get some infrastructure reimbursement, but all the streets needed to be public to do it. And we decided we really wanted to maintain all the streets as private streets. And so in that case, we decided not to do it. But in the case of like our East River project, where it's literally city building, there's not an option. I mean, it's not financially feasible to go build that level of infrastructure without public participation and having public streets.
And so when you're doing a public-private partnership, I guess my first question is it the private developer that kind of makes the first pass at this as a structure that would work for us? Or is it the public department going, here's a project, these are the terms we're willing to do it under, see if you can make it work? Or does it, where does it start from?
Yeah, so I'll use I'll use 2 different examples, but so our East River project, I would say, is, there's an existing TERS. We knew that was the best reimbursement sort of structure. And so there you had a defined box. And then it was really, being open book and putting all the numbers in front of the city and understanding the amount of increment we're going to create, how much of that are we going to get back, and then how much of the infrastructure cost was it going to reimburse, which still isn't anywhere near 100%. So that one, you sort of have a defined structure, right, and mechanism to utilize. In the case of of Kirby Grove and Levy Park, which I mentioned, that was really a creative process where actually it was the Upper Kirby Management District that came to us and said, we have a park, no one's ever in it. You guys have all these green spaces that always have people in it. Can you help us think through this? And I'm simplifying it, but ultimately the structure we came up with was we would agree to do, X millions of development, which would create enough tax increment for them to turn around and sell bonds to build the park. And the park was about $15 million. But then to have access to development sites, we agreed to ground lease those sites. So those ground lease payments would go back to funding the maintenance of the park. And it's one of the biggest challenges with public spaces and public parks is it's not just the cost to build it, it's the cost to maintain it. That's actually the big cost, and maintain it right. And of course, if we were going to go build, these fantastic boutique office buildings and residential towers adjacent to the park, we wanted to make sure the park was always maintained at a first-class standard. But what is seemingly a fairly simple structure took us about 2 years to figure out.
Yep. And then my last question on public-private partnerships, and it's probably case by case, but it sounds like in the case of Kirby Grove, they came to you. In most of those situations, is it an RFP process, or y'all find a piece of public land that you kind of approach them, or is it usually through the public reaching out to the private?
Yeah, I would say for the most part, it's us trying to find market, what we think of as market opportunities, and then to really, deliver what's the most impactful project for the city or the community is, are there public dollars available and can that play a role? Fortunately, I think we've developed a reputation of being good folks to work with. We try to operate on a very transparent and collaborative basis. And people know, I think, when we come to the table, we're asking not because we're trying to necessarily put, $2 more in our pocket, but we're asking because we're trying to make it the best we can.
One more question, just kind of on real estate in Texas, and then I kind of want to just chat a little bit about ULI, and then we'll get to some personal questions to wrap it up. But One thing that's come up a bunch is property taxes in Texas keep rising pretty dramatically, especially in the last kind of 5 to 10 years. Do you have any opinion, or do you sit on any board? I mean, you know a lot of the people around the state. Is this just something that we're in for a ride to see how high property taxes go, or do we think we're going to see them kind of taper off, especially with COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it is a challenge, and it's a challenge on both sides, right? I mean, I don't think there's anybody that disagrees. The revenue is probably needed, but at the same time, there is sort of this sustainability question from the standpoint of who's paying those taxes. And I think where right now where the public sector maybe doesn't fully appreciate is they think about office, especially and even retail, as sort of net leases, and they're saying, "Oh, landlord, you're just passing that on." What they forget is we're all sort of somewhat held to a market standard, right? We have to be in a range, and ultimately, the tenant is looking at what is my total cost. So, regardless of lease structure, they're still looking at their gross number, and so to the point, there is a gross number they're willing to pay and taxes keep pushing up expenses, then it's just eroding net rents. And ultimately, that's then eroding values, which is counterproductive. And so it is a challenge, and it's something we have to get our arms around. And I think it's an education process. But look, cities are going to be really challenged, with shortfalls from the impact of COVID, both from the revenue side and the cost side. And so it's, we're in for a challenge.
Okay, so you are the chairman of Americas of ULI. What has ULI meant to you, and why has it been important?
Yeah. So my first connection with ULI was really as a graduate student, and I would go to the library and read case studies. And I just found it fascinating to sort of try to understand how people actually did this thing called development that I was interested in. And I will say early in my career, when I was with the first company I mentioned, I actually wasn't very good about networking. And when I came to Midway, I kind of had a window into an appreciation for, the networks Brad had built. And so, ULI was really where I decided to invest my time. And I think for me, while I've been involved in, NAOP and ICSC and all great organizations, at least for me, ULI was always the biggest tent of people, right? From all product sectors, from the public sector, from the private sector. And I always enjoyed that. And so, got very involved in ULI Houston and the district council here, was ultimately became chair here and chaired the spring meeting when we had it in Houston, and then got more involved nationally. And, for me, it's just been, and the other thing I'd say, it's a truly global organization. And I think for all of us, even though I can look at our company and say, well, we operate in Texas, that doesn't mean we shouldn't have an appreciation for or understand what's going on around the globe impacts us.
Right.
And so I always appreciated that. And it's just been, I've formed great relationships there. I think, the content is unbelievable. It's always been a place where I can learn, whether that's through, content or through my relationships there. And so, much of the time that I spend in the organization to me is just giving back what I've gained. And the reality is, like anything in life, the more you give, the more you end up getting out of it. And so it's just, for me, for 25 years, it's just been an integral part of my career, and sort of how I think about real estate, how I think about the impact of real estate, and how I find and look up to mentors and learn from them. So it's been great.
I love it. You've talked about community on your website. You guys talk a lot about giving back, and y'all have a foundation called the Midway Foundation. I just wanted to ask you kind of what that is and why it's important to Midway.
Yeah, and I give full credit to Brad for this. This was really his, something he had conviction about, and for us, it was twofold. It was very simple kind of biblical principle that to whom much is given, much is expected. And we've been blessed, and it's important for us to give back. I think one of the tangential benefits that maybe we didn't realize was if we have this spirit of generosity or display, this notion of giving back, is we can actually teach our team members how to give back and support them, in what's interesting to them and where they can give back. And what became apparent to me is, I was fortunate to grow up in a family that was not necessarily sort of largely philanthropic from a dollar standpoint, but always had conviction about giving back. And the reality is some people don't grow up with that experience. And so they almost need to be taught how to give back. And it's not because they don't want to. It's just they've never experienced it or been exposed to it. So I think that's been a great byproduct. And we put 5% of the ownership in our projects in the foundation, and that's largely the funding mechanism. We have some focus areas for the foundation, which is largely focused around education, underprivileged children, and health and wellness. But then outside of that, we support really whatever our team members want to, wherever they're willing to, give of their own time and money, we're willing to support that. The other thing we do that I would urge, and ask every company to think about is, because it's easy to give and yet it's incredibly powerful, is we give every team member one day off a month to give back. And so that's 12 days a year, but across 140 people now in our company, that has real impact. And if you think about, if we could build sort of that across lots and lots of organizations, the impact can be just immense. And the reality is I think while people go, oh, geez, I need them working at that time. I think we get back in just multiples of the time we give them. And it's just, it's perspective. It's about culture. A lot of our team members end up taking those days and doing things together, and they form bonds and relationships during that time. So of our core values, we have 7. The original 6: integrity, passion, adaptability, equality, initiative, and teamwork were actually developed by the team years ago. We actually added generosity later on because we just felt it was, so important and fundamental to who we are.
Man, I love that. I just made that note. I've never heard somebody say that they give their team a day off a month to go give back, but that's awesome. And you're right. The compounding effect of that, if everybody did it, would be massive.
I think, it's for us as leaders to lead and set the example. And, there's no lack of need in our communities. And so if we can play a small role, and, as I said, I think in our DNA, we're community builders. And so to us, that's just an integral piece of what we do.
I love it, man. Okay. Do you have a morning routine and something that gets your day going?
I do. And I've actually gotten, I think the older I've gotten, the more adamant I've gotten about doing it. Part of that is once your kids get a little older, it's easier. But mornings aren't quite as hectic, and mine are both in college now. But so I typically get up and then I'll work out for 30 to 45 minutes at home. And then probably about 5 years ago, I started playing around with meditating, and I am admittedly, kind of an attention deficit problem. And for whatever reason, that really does help. And most days I do it for about 10 minutes. And then after that, I'll read something from the Bible every day. It's usually in the form of a devotional, and then pray. And that, to me, just those 3 things get the day started right for me. And it's, I find if I start the day sort of hectic and frazzled, that tends to not stop the rest of the day. And it just kind of, you're worn out at the end. And so my team probably likes me a lot better when I start the day with those those three things. But it's hard. We all have obligations, whether they're breakfast meetings or board meetings or whatever. But actually, more and more, I've gotten very deliberate about protecting that time, and also just, I think, self-awareness. I'm 51 now. That you got to take care of yourself physically, and I find if I work out every day, I stick with it. If I try to work out 3 or 4 days a week, there's always an excuse, another day not to work out, and then it just kind of unravels. And so I just try to commit to do it every day.
I love it. Is there anything that jumps to mind of the best advice you've ever been given?
God, I've been blessed to, have the luxury of seeking advice, and mentorship from a lot of people that have helped shape, I think, who I am and my career. And it didn't come from one person, but it's certainly, I think, been the aha moment in my career and I talked about it relative to values. And some of it was just something, I think in my first job when I left, that was foundational for me, that I realized, values weren't, those were a foundation, and I was never going to be willing to compromise those. And so I would say the aha moment, which came later, it was always important to me, but how you truly integrate, values into your organization. And, we have a whole hiring process really built around those 7 core values. And we ask people to write about what those values mean to them personally and professionally. And I can weed out a candidate, in 2 seconds reading that, and not say we're going to hire everyone based on a good response, but you either get the dictionary version or you get a response that is truly sort of meaningful and tells you that those are values that is important to somebody. And so, we've been blessed to build a team, and where it became so prevalent to me as we went through a growth spurt, and we sort of had some churn. And I was like, what are we missing? And what came back to me was the people that kind of came and went. There sort of wasn't a basic kind of DNA connection relative to values. And it's like getting married. It's not that you're gonna go through difficult times, but if your foundation is the same, then you're going to be able to work through those together. And I've kind of taken the same approach to trying to build the DNA around building a team here, that let's start with values. And if we start there, chances are, we're going to have a much higher success rate. And so I think, when I have the opportunity to try to give back and talk to other folks starting businesses or young entrepreneurs, I really try to highlight that have conviction about what you stand for. Don't ever compromise it, and then try to build what it is you stand for into your organization and be deliberate about it as possible.
I love it. All right, last question. We'll pick the most busy highway in the country, and you own a billboard on that highway, and you could put anything on it for the world to see. What would you put on that billboard?
I would put "Leave it better than you found it."
I love it, man. Thank you so much for joining me today. I look forward to seeing you soon. It's been a while, but yeah, it was great to connect.
Well, thanks so much for doing this, and honored to be asked to do it. And I think a ton of you and your organization, and always love catching up.
Hey everyone, it's Chris here again. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, leave a 5-star rating, or write a quick review. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Chris Powers is the founder and CEO of Fort Capital LP. All opinions from Chris and guests of the Fort Podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Fort Capital LP. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for real estate or investment decisions. The Fort with Chris Powers is produced by Straight Up Podcasts.